Hi, you're listening to the NewSpace India podcast, a bi weekly talk show that exclusively brings insights from the Indian space activities ecosystem. I'm your host, Narayan, the co founder of India's first space focused think tank, Spaceport Sarabhai. Guests on the NewSpace India podcast help you understand space activities related macro and micro trends within India in all aspects, including space history, local industry, space science, technology evolution, law and policy, art, and more. The NewSpace India podcast is supported by Dassault Systems, a global leader in providing businesses and people with collaborative virtual environments to enable sustainable innovations. Dassault Systems Solutions supports startups, small and medium-scale enterprises, and original equipment manufacturers in developing disruptive solutions for space launchers and satellites. Hi, and welcome to yet another episode of the NewSpace India podcast. Today, we have here Apurwa, who is one of the co-founders of a company called SpaceFields that is based in Bangalore and incubated in the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. So, Apurwa, thank you so much for taking the time to speaking with me today, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Narayan. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great opportunity to speak here, which we have been listening for a while. So I am really excited that you're now recording newer episodes. So yeah, happy to be here.
So let's go back to what your founding team is and why begin a company like SpaceFields. What is the background of your team and where did this idea of starting a company like SpaceFields has come about?
So we are actually three co-founders, myself, Ronak and Sudarshan. We are batchmates from the same university. It's VSS UT Burla in Odisha. It's one of the oldest universities in the country, established back in 1956, even before any of the IITs came in. It was actually in 2016. 2016 was the Diamond Jubilee year of our university. So 1956, 2016, it was celebrating 60 years of existence. And our institute has produced well over 40,000 alumni spread across the world. And it was celebrating a global alumni meet. And there a problem statement came up that the Hirakud Dam, which is the world's longest dam, just a few kilometers away from our university, it's facing sedimentation, siltation, and there are not enough ways to measure it actively in a real time. We took that as a problem statement. We started, how do we approach this? Of course, drones and underwater rovers, these were not feasible because the dam is very vast. It's a 26-kilometer long dam. The catchment area is twice the size of Sri Lanka. Then we immediately realized we had to go higher into altitude. And of course, there was NRSC. They have satellite images. They already do a lot of surveying for such projects. But we started that we should build our own small CanSat, launch it using our own sounding rocket to the desired altitude that we want. And the rocket ejects the payload at the apogee. And we recover both of them through a parachute. And while the payload descends, it captures the images of the dam. It would have lidar and other sensors on board. That's how we got started into rocketry. Of course, our institute does not have an aerospace department. I am a civil engineer and a structural engineer. I completed masters in structural. When we initially pitched these ideas, it was obviously preposterous. We did not have any background, no dedicated workspace to work. So everything literally started out of our hostel backyards, our own pocket money. And yeah, it was the alumni who supported us. They were well placed in ISRO, DRDO, ISC. They gave us the backing, and that's how we got started. Dozens and dozens of our rockets blew up, nosedived before it took a proper flight and deployed payload at the altitude that we wanted. Yeah, that's how we got started. 2016 to 2020, we built and launched 7 sounding rockets successfully up to 5-kilometer altitude. We could have gone higher, but 5 kilometers is like the DGC airspace level. Yeah, from there, I think we inherently had a attraction towards space. We got opportunity to work at ISRO, DRDO, train at ISRO and DRDO. And then it was, after graduation, it was a natural levitation towards starting a space tech company, and hence SpaceFields was born.
And that's very interesting background to how you guys have matured this idea, because often teams don't carry forward after graduation and everybody goes their own way to a large extent. So one thing that comes to my mind here is obviously you guys were in Odisha and you're now in Bangalore to a large extent. How did this evolution takes place where You come from a college project to then going ahead into a more professional environment and kicking off your own company. That's a very big change to be have done. So, what is the reason why you levitated towards Bangalore, and how did this idea of really having a concrete idea around launch vehicles come about?
Sure, sure. No, yeah, somewhere in 2020, I think the unlocking reforms of the sector were announced, and we had been in rocketry much before that. Honorable Prime Minister spoke about us in his Man Ki Baat program back in January 2019. We registered a Limca Book of Record, Asia Book of Record for building and launching a series of sounding rockets. Trained at somewhere, I think. So I was training in the summer of 2018 at ISRO Ahmedabad. Dr. Tapan Mishra was the then director, and I was in a team called Vedas, Visualization of Earth Observation Data and Archival System. And that time, I think Adani Green Energy had approached SAC and they signed an MOU. Adani was planning to establish solar power plants. They wanted weather and satellite information around how to maximize the energy output, best location, average sunlight power or solar variation, and all of that. So that's how I think I realized that there is immense commercial value in the sector, that space derived data is the new oil. And obviously, satellites around the Earth are there to collect these data, but they need rockets first to put them into the desired orbit. When the COVID hit, we graduated. We first went into some jobs to stabilize things. I was in a financial services firm. My other two co-founders, one was in L&T, one was in Accenture, and all of us were in Bangalore. Uh, so that's how there was a transition to Bangalore. And when we finally, after the third wave, incorporated the company, Bangalore was the natural choice because the ecosystem was here. We immediately got incubated by IIC. So yeah, that was evolution.
So, how easy is it to get incubated in a place like IIC? Because obviously, IIC is a very reputed organization and they have a very strong, I am sure that they have a very strong filter to incubating companies in one form or the other. What is the process of for any other founder interested in the space tech realm in getting incubated and then through selection process again?
Right. Of course, IIC primarily so only does deep tech or deep science, right? That's the first criteria. Second, the criteria is that you have to have a faculty advisor from IIC first before you even apply. Our faculty advisor is Dr. Pratikash Panda from Propulsion in Aerospace Department. Apart from that, there are other faculty who are engaged with Dr. Charlie and Dr. Radhakant Padi. There has to be an IIC faculty on board with you. And third is what IIC or SID, to be specific, primarily looks at is founder product fit, because when incubating such early stage, there is no PMF. So you have to look at founder product fit. And there, I think some demonstrable experience always carries weight. So of course, they have incubated Bellatrix, Digantra, Astrom before us. So they have a sound understanding. And yeah, all of these three takes and you can get into SID, ISC, yes.
Great. So, what is SpaceFields? What is the idea behind the company, and what is it that you exactly want to achieve?
Sure. We initially started with, of course, the conceptualization happened with launch as a big market. So many launch companies coming up. India needs its own launch company. So of course, it initially started with that idea that small satellite launch segment is an extremely lucrative business. But as lucrative as it may be, it's extremely cap intensive as well. So we realized that very quickly with just 1 or 2 months of pitching and talking to people. So we had to think so as to how do we appeal the pitch to attract capital. And to be honest, it's extremely difficult at the moment for any startup, especially in space tech, to raise their first check, because I feel most of the risk capital has been absorbed by all these 10, 12 startups and investors are yet to see a return. So we immediately gravitated towards what is something that we can quickly build and monetize. So that's how our focus emerged into solid rocket propulsion. Right. Dual use solid rocket propulsion. We realized that there are launch vehicle players, there are satellite propulsion players, startups, but there are no solid rocket propulsion players or solid rocket engine makers here in India. So given our own self-taught experience of doing solid rocket propulsion with our dozens of sounding rockets, we got into it. Of course, there's a high barrier to entry. It's a highly regulated space. So right now our focus is dual use solid rocket propulsion for space and defense. Yes.
Right, and it's a very interesting niche. Obviously, there's been this niche of solid rocket propulsion for many decades now In fact, most of them rockets have evolved from this. So, uh, from what you are mentioning, what type of businesses are you into? Because obviously, solid rockets are can be used both in the civilian space and free segment at the same time. So the companies like Skyroot and Agnikul, they are, one could say that they are in the civilian space launch delivery systems, and their market is then small satellites and uh, constellations of civilian small satellites or whatever, even defense satellites if they want to launch them and if they have an opportunity. So you guys are then talking about system that can be used both for defense as well as civilian use cases.
Yes. Yeah. When, of course, when we got started, the reason we had to naturally gravitate towards defense, and yeah, typical investors or people generally don't like defense or government as a customer, but nonetheless, we gravitated towards defense naturally because that's where I think the funds were. Because unfortunately, although we have opened space, ISRO is not funding startups at the earliest stages. So defense, there are lots of routes that you can get funds from. You can sustain, you can build credibility, there are early adopters. Um, so dual use solid rocket propulsion in defense, of course, from micro missiles to large ICBMs, we all know it uses small to large solid rocket engines. And while in space, strap-on motors to abort motors, thrust motors, spacecraft and kick motors, a lot of them use solid rocket engines. There is a third vertical that we're also targeting that we initially did not envisage, but in an expo that we were presenting, a large drone customer approached us and they wanted us to build. They saw our solid rocket engines and they said, can you build micro solid rocket engines for drones? Because they wanted to build kamikaze drone, loitering munition drone, and tube based launch drones, which themselves employ micro rocket propulsion systems. We are engaging with a large drone customer as well to see how we can miniaturize these solid rocket engines so that the drones can achieve higher altitudes or have a soft kill or hard kill capability. So these are the three verticals that we are primarily targeting.
Again, interesting in that sense. So maybe to just talk through on the timing of this, because at the end of the day, a lot of the companies, a lot of the startups, as well as the ability for them to mature. There was a survey that said that I think obviously about 60 to 70% of the success of a company is based on the timing of the timeline and the timing to the market. Right. It'll be interesting to know what is your thesis about why is this the right time and why is India the right place for this? Because obviously you have in a space where governmental customers and government capacity exists to a large extent. So ISRO has its delivery systems, DRDO has its delivery systems, and you are now trying to innovate in this space. It would be very interesting to know why you think this is the right time and this is the right product and like India is the right place.
Sure. So, of course, first of all, there is a macro scenario, right? There is liberalization of defense, there is privatization of space. So, government wants to encourage more and more startups to come up, more and more competition to happen, and more innovation to happen, right? So, of course, large companies do exist, but they are primarily, so to say, they are contractors. They're limited as vendors. And one of the reasons startups are an essential part of slow moving industries like aerospace and defense is that they drive innovation through fast and lean execution. So all these incumbents, they're often more concerned with the bottom line than they are with sweeping advancements. It's very critically important that startups come up, otherwise the industry itself would risk stagnation. The nation that now we are building critical capabilities both in upstream and downstream, the timing of it is again important from a strategic standpoint, that startups need to come up, need to drive this innovation, build large value out of these sectors. And I think the government was they made they took the right steps because they realized which are the sectors where we have a large capability but we have not gotten our deserving market share, and space was one of them. And that's why now all of this focus is there, and hence we feel that building out of India for the globe is the right time to do so. Yeah, that's about the timing of it.
And the timing, obviously, we talked about, but in terms of the customer base that you are looking at, this is also an interesting part of this, right? Because obviously, with a civilian focused customer base, you can still target a lot of the international markets. And so obviously, the trade in the civilian space is easier in customer acquisition in the international customer base. So, what is it that you foresee? You foresee that government of India becoming your default anchor customer to this, or your first customers will then come from abroad? How this would envision from your perspective?
Yeah, of course. Since I am talking about missiles, so to say, then of course government has to become the first early anchor customer. The sales cycle, yes, it's difficult. It's difficult to first get your foot into the door. It's difficult to establish credibility. It's difficult to get money out of government. So yes, there is no reason to say that there are no risks here or there are no difficulties here. But nonetheless, I think it's worth trying for us. One, because of what I said, that government has a positive outlook towards it. So that's one. Second, it has a very large export opportunity. Let it be G2G or let it be B2G. It has a very large export opportunity there. And third, what we have not even yet factored in is the drone opportunity. A lot of private contractors who are coming up who want to build drones for defense, drones for homeland security. That's an emerging sector. And as the drone threat rises, the counter drone market is also becoming extremely opportunistic. So there was this incident, I think some happened that a single drone took down a large 10,000 crore plant or something in Aramco. We are working on a project with a defense contractor. We are building a highly precise counter drone kill system, which is again a small 2 foot micro. So yeah, these opportunities exist, and yes, we are hoping that the government of India is a early anchor to us. So that's why we are in this space. Yeah.
One thing that you mentioned, which is very interesting, is the word credibility, because this is the central thing to any business in this space as such. How do you build credibility? That's the key question, right? Because obviously one part of this is your background of having gotten some experience working through the system and incubating yourself in IIC and so on. But for your business to thrive, what are the steps building this credibility journey?
Right. Yes. So credibility is extremely important, especially in a country like India, right? So everybody from any government funding agency to any private investor, they're going to ask about credibility, and it's extremely tough to establish credibility. Unlike the West, where we see even very young startups, very young founders getting into the space. So one, I think we have to take small steps, and there is no easy way to do it. So that's why we started with very small pilot projects that we can deliver just to build credibility. I think any startup should first focus on, of course there's a very large vision, but you have to break it down to actionable points at a day level. So what do you do the next day? How do you go and sell out to your potential customer? I think that's very important. Start small. Like, you no need to go out and to DRDO asking for a multi-crore project. So we went out to the DRDO missile cluster, the defense armament cluster. Primarily that's where we lies. So we asked them for small pilot projects, and nothing very big. Let it be few lakhs. Just execute a system, build a system and execute it and deliver it. I think that builds a lot of credibility at first. And of course, since the ecosystem, the private ecosystem is picking up, the startup ecosystem is picking up, everything is nascent. So always there is someone who has to take a leap of faith, right? So there is this big situation that we face on a day-to-day level, that someone like DRDO or someone, if someone has to give an order, then there is a very large procurement process. What facility do you have? What capability do you have? Setting up this facility and capability itself requires funds. So it's a very difficult catch 22 situation. But you have to sell your story and somehow get someone to take a leap of faith. Either get someone to give you an order or get someone to give you funds. Yeah, I understand that there are a myriad of startup failure statistics that we all hear about it. 80 to 90% fail within 5 years, 10 years. But the seismic takeaway is that anyways, the odds are stacked against startups, more so for us, right? That we are in difficult industries. But for every Edison, Jobs, Gates or Musk, I think there are perhaps thousands who tried. They had a piece for a while but lost it eventually. So I think it's important to try it out first, have actionable steps, sell something even before you have anything. Yeah, building credibility one step at a time. It's the hardest way possible. So yeah.
What is the mood like in the investor world to a company like you? Because this is a space where I'm sure that a lot of investors don't have any clue about what is the landscape like, and for them to take a call on what kind of risk is in it for them in the investment space. And it seems to me that there could be two types of investors that are really interested in this space, right? So one is really maybe companies who have always existed in the defense space and are looking to diversify and use innovative companies like you to put out new products and then be a part of that success story to a large extent. Or it could be somebody who is a really bold deep tech investor and wants to look at an area like defense to then have a go at this, right? What is the landscape like at this point of time?
So yeah, as I said, the investor outlook is extremely difficult at the moment, and even for, let's say, someone like Skyroot and Agnikul or slightly matured companies, they have difficulties raising growth capital, while we are at our very like pre-seed seed stage, and we have difficulty raising our first checks because of all sorts of typical reasons you must have heard about. There is no thesis, we don't understand this domain, it's hardware, which is bad. That we Why are we so afraid of hardware when a lot of value it can create? Large amount of gestation, highly capital intensive sectors. Again, there are these companies that spend hundreds of crores worth of marketing down the drain and still loss making companies. Imagine if those hundreds of crores can go into some R&D company which can build technology that is worth billions, if not less. The investor outlook, I think, will change with time. Probably some success stories out from some of our more matured startups would change the outlook of this industry. But till that time, I think we have to persevere and exist and continue to build small, just build every day nonetheless. And talking about large companies that have existed in this space that would have a natural affinity to this space, but when these companies, I have interacted with a lot of them, they are again highly slow moving. No one wants to risk during their top line and bottom line, as opposed to say someone like Lockheed Martin or Raytheon in the West, who invest in a number of startups. But we have not seen startup investments from our large conglomerates that there are in this space, right? I think the entire industry outlook has to change, and that would change if startups like us, they bring credibility and bring success out there. So yeah.
What would you think is the role of government here? Because there is a very important thing here, which is going beyond news and press as well as announcements, which is very important for companies to survive and thrive. Because obviously, I appreciated that the government is opening up to companies like you, and they're opening up to the private sector to a large extent. But it should not be just signaling, but it should be also in action to a large extent, right? So I know that there's some scheme like IDEX and other things that have been taken off to a large extent now. But beyond these initial things that have happened with IDEX and so on, there are two major aspects that are very important and interesting, right? One is really what you already mentioned, the word procurement, and easing out procurement for companies like you, where you're given an opportunity to show that you have credibility and you have the capability in terms of becoming an anchor customer to a product that doesn't exist to a large extent. So that is one aspect of overhauling procurement, and would be interesting to know your view on that. And the second is really, I think I'm not a very big fan generally of government giving direct money. I would much rather have government give contracts, even if they are products that don't exist to a large extent, so that people can go raise money based on that demand. So that is something that I always talk about to a large extent, because handing out money is a very slippery slope, and it may not lead to any outcomes to a large extent. So would love to hear your thoughts around this.
Yes. See, I totally resonate with your thoughts, and I recently read one of your posts. I think 5 year outlook on where you have, I think, touched based on a lot of these points. For all our listeners here, I think if they haven't read it, they should. So one, of course, government has to create this demand even before it exists, anchor it out as an early customer, assured markets. Um, this will give some incentive, give some comfort to the private investors in this space. Second is, yes, the procurement process, it needs to be overhauled, needs to be eased out. We as a startup regularly struggle with defense procurement process, to be specific. And third is, I think there is an inherent amount of risk taking ability that needs to trickle down from the top to the very grassroots level. It's not just that the entrepreneurs are taking all the risk here, right? The entire ecosystem has to take certain amount of risk, and that includes each and every one in this ecosystem. A typical DRDO scientist to a typical bureaucrat in the space or defense department, they all have to accept a certain amount of risk. I think some steps have been taken. You mentioned about IDEX, there is TDF. These steps have been taken to demand fund these startups at an early stage, but a lot has to be done, not just in letter but in spirit. It's absolutely important that the entire ecosystem absorbs this entrepreneurial mindset within themselves, this risk taking mindset within themselves, if we have to leapfrog in these sectors.
And if I have to put you into a spot, I would love to ask you what, in your perspective, should be done for procurement as well as demand creation that you believe will really catalyze what you are doing.
I think so. There is always this challenge that the government faces, because at the end of the day, it's taxpayers' money, and the amount of risk that they can take with taxpayers' money is extremely limited. They have a spectacle. They also have to be with where they put taxpayers' money into. But there is a way that they have to statistically define that how many startups can they fund, with risks, failures or probabilities can be incorporated in that model. Of course, hundreds of startups, even if say 10 or 15 or 20 succeed, you are going to see your money back eventually, probably tenfold. What the government needs to do is identify, I think people look into demonstrable experience, what they have done, even with the least amount of resources, whatever they had. If they built something out of nothing, help them with small contracts, let it be 50 lakh, 1 crore, small contracts, have deliverables, have milestones, have tranches, everything, and just support this. So the another challenge what typically the government infrastructure faces is lack of manpower. So ISRO scientists, DRDO scientists, they are already choked with projects. They're choked with their own deliverables. DRDO has to deliver systems and all this continuously for the end users, for the forces. ISRO has to do their own space missions. They are dedicated workforce. Now, of course, in space has come up, but yeah, I think the manpower is also a big issue here. That everyone, I speak to DRDO scientists regularly. Someone says I have 40 projects currently at my plate, I have 50 projects currently at my plate, then why do I add to another project? It adds to all my burden, right? So I think that has also to be eased out in some way. There is no silver bullet answer to it, but I think it can begin with at least that we need to put out the red carpets to startups and support them in whatever way possible.
Yeah, this is a very complex problem for sure to a large extent. And for me, one thing that I didn't mention in that article that I put together that I always now reflect on, and probably I will write a follow up of that particular article, is procurement has two sides to it, really. So, one is really how do you incentivize companies? And also, the second part of it, which I didn't mention in that article, is how do you provide immunity to bureaucrats? Because the problem is that I can empathize with a lot of people in the system, either in ISRO or DRDO or all of these places, because they have rules to follow as well, and they cannot take any decisions out of turn, and they need the higher orbit people to give them that kind of a system where they have immunity to take such decisions as well. And unfortunately, that immunity doesn't exist because procurement mechanisms are very centralized, and decentralized procurement systems are not yet there yet in the country, or decentralized procurement mechanisms based on the sector, and especially placing strategic sectors like defense and space outside of the usual sphere and creating dedicated channels for that is a very big change. And to a large part, that involves providing immunity to bureaucrats who can take bold decisions.
Yes, giving them all the resources that they need to take this decision. I think a lot of defense procurement is also happening on GEM, government e-marketplace. So yeah, it's positive, but we're not there yet. We're far from there yet, and we can just, as entrepreneurs, we can just grasp that tiny small hope and keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you are doing is extremely difficult for sure. And trying itself is a very big thing in this sort of a space. And I can only imagine because it's a very tough space to operate in. And trying itself is a big step to a large extent. So, when you're talking about the milestones that you want to achieve, to be very honest with you, I think this space may need another 5 to 7 years to evolve to a large extent, right? It may not be something that happens overnight, or the government is going into the election mode next year, and then you will not see a lot of progress on any kind of big decisions to a large extent. So you'll need to survive that next 5 to 7 year period to emerge out of all of this, and again keep building credibility. So how do you foresee surviving and thriving in this horizon? And do you have enough committed horizon or even other mechanisms such as government grants or other ways in which you can keep up the innovation to be able to make it in that time frame?
Yep. So definitely. So sector we are in, it's nascent. It's in itself. So it's important that any startup here has at least, if not 12 to 18 months of runway. Even 12 is a small period, to be honest. For us personally, yes, we have adequate runway for the next year, for this coming year particularly. We have grants in the pipeline. We have a lot of personal capital committed. Um, we have 6 or 7 multi-crore projects, mostly in DRDO and IDEX, that are in the pipeline. No breakthrough yet to happen, but hopefully we have to just persevere. I think there's also, we did not mention TDB, Technology Development Board of DST, who is now giving out soft loans that startups should capitalize on. So yeah, we need to have ensured at least a 12 to 18 month runway before we plan to do anything. And in that time, you have to keep coming up with milestones, such as keep accelerating your TRL levels, and hopefully some investor is going to take a punt on you down the line, but you don't know when that's going to happen. So you just have to keep talking to them and keep updating them. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Good luck with all of this. Is definitely a very big challenge as such. So I wanted to know, how big is your team at the moment, and how do you foresee this delivery of some of these projects as well? Because obviously one of the most critical aspects of this is to have a team that can operate around every subsystem and every aspect of this. How is your team matured over the course of the time that you have been in existence?
So we are a 12-membered full-time team, including the three founders, of course. We have aerospace engineers, propulsion engineers, avionics engineers, mechanical engineers. Our team is young, to be honest, 0 to 3 years experience, because that's how we can afford at the moment, to be honest. Apart from that, there are advisors who help us free of charge, so to say, which is difficult to get. Ex ISRO, ex DRDO, IIC. So we have to leverage all of that expertise to keep to the north light for us, to that we're going in the right direction. And we want to do hiring uh, from a few months from now, hopefully, for certain specific projects, because it requires a certain specific amount of expertise. Mm, from there, I think once there is a large amount of funding, then you can hire very senior leadership. We have already identified those people who are advising us.
So, from the perspective of testing, for example, is a very critical area. This is something that we didn't talk about. Obviously, the way in which you can test out a lot of your equipment is very different to other companies to a large extent, and especially even the ones that you mentioned, like the application in drones, is again very interesting. And normally, obviously, again, testing is a big part of the landscape for government organizations as well, and they have their dedicated centers with char and then DRDO and all of these Abdul Kalam and all of these places. So how is the testing landscape for a company like you, because you're a private company, and is there access to testing facilities for you guys?
Yes, yeah. Just I think a week ago or so, we unveiled India's first aerospike engine. We cold flow tested it within IIC's propulsion complex. So one part of getting incubated with IIC is we get free or subsidized access to all the labs, all the facilities that are there within the institute. Apart from that, we have to have larger facilities, access to larger facilities as well. And to be honest, I think government has done a lot towards opening it. Today, at any point, you can log on to, say, HAL, BDL, BEL, all of these defense PSUs or the DRDO facilities, and there is a dedicated information that you are going to find out that these are the testing facilities that are available with us. You can write us here, you can reach us here if you're a private sector company, and they will facilitate the access to it. And of course, ISRO you can access now through InSpace. We are in touch with them. Apart from that, if you have to test real life sort of special, this is specifically for defense, there is army has something called an army design bureau. Navy has something called NIO, Naval Innovation and Imagination Organization, where you can actually go to the say the front line and test your product. So there are frameworks now that I think the government has put up across all its defense PSUs, agencies, different departments. You just need to find the right information and follow it up with the concerned person to get access to it.
Right. From pure play maturity of your company, to me, at least from the outside, looks like the drone may be the first immediate opportunity, and then maybe either the defense or space, whichever works out to a large extent. Maybe defense first because it doesn't maybe involve a lot of.
Yes, defense first. Absolutely. So drones are the early adopters, but ticket sizes in terms of revenue, it's less. Nonetheless, revenue. Second is yes, defense. So we have discussed multiple pilot projects with the missile cluster. Um, Tiny projects, as I said, just to establish credibility. So defense, and of course then space would kick in.
So from the things that you would want to have in the next 12 months or so, good luck with all the proposals that you've made and the outcomes for it. But beyond those proposals, I guess the most important aspect of this is capital, and that's what probably you will be looking for. Anything else that you would be looking out for?
Nothing specific. There's the union budget coming up. I think we have some expectations there. So just the hope of that government eases up in a lot of areas. Government itself has ambitious plans, but eases up in a lot of areas, right from funding, how to get access to capital, get access to market, easier regulations, all of that. I think the government has a lot of tedious job to do while we need to build and test our solid rocket engines in the coming year. So
Great, Apurva. I think what you're doing is extremely difficult and needs a lot of patience and commitment. And good luck with everything that you are doing. You're breaking your head into a problem that is extremely challenging to a large extent. But I mean, it's kudos to you and your co-founders to having gone into an area which is super challenging. And I'm pretty sure that there'll be a lot of interesting things that gets out of this, and maybe even inspires a lot of other people and the government to also make some changes. So thank you so much for spending the time with me in talking about everything. And I would love to keep in touch and be supportive as I can be. And good luck with everything that
sure, Narayan. No, thanks to you for providing such a platform for all of us to speak, all of various stakeholders to speak. And you guys are also doing an immense amount of good work with spaceports. So all the best to you too with Sat Search and everything you do.
Thank you so much. Thank you for listening in to this episode of the NewSpace India podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share this episode with anyone you believe will enjoy listening to it. You'll be able to find the NewSpace India podcast in any of the podcasting platforms that you may be using, including Apple, Google, Spotify, YouTube, and others. Do subscribe to the podcast in case you want to receive new episodes automatically. I'm grateful if you're able to leave a rating for the podcast, which will help others discover it. Thank you for listening in again, and the next episode will be out in the next 2 weeks as usual.